Welcome to this NWBA Reflection, which is one of a series that we're offering to churches and individuals as our way of trying to support you and sustain you through these difficult times. And if you find it helpful and you haven't seen them, then you can find several others either through our YouTube channel or through our website. Now, I guess that many of us have found ourselves in recent weeks with extra time on our hands, and we've ended up clearing out drawers and cupboards and finding things that we'd lost, or perhaps things that we'd forgotten that we even owned. And that's how I came across this magnifying glass, which I think probably belongs to my son if everybody had their own. But I was prompted to look it out again after a recent online meeting of our NWBA team, because one of the words that came up quite a few times in that meeting was this word magnify. In particular, we were reflecting on some of the conversations that we've had with churches and leaders and other individuals. And one of the messages that was coming back to us kind of again and again was that everything seems to feel a little bit magnified at the moment. You know, we are going through a time of crisis, and that is impacting every one of us as individuals. And everything that we experience personally, we are experiencing against a backdrop of uncertainty and concern, and a narrative that's almost ongoing in that respect. So if we are someone who tends to be anxious, then it is more than likely that our anxiety is going to be heightened at the moment. And equally, if we're someone who perhaps tends to see an opportunity and purpose, even in the midst of a crisis, then perhaps our expectations might be unrealistically high at the moment. Our feelings are being magnified by the circumstances. Now, to a large degree, this is natural because there are many things that are generating concern for us at the moment. Many of us are in various situations of lockdown, and therefore we've also got more time to mull on those things that concern us. So yeah, things are becoming amplified and magnified. The uncertainties we face, the concerns we have, the frustrations, even our hopes and dreams will become particularly intense. And of course, not all of us feel the same way about things, which means that there will be inevitably differences of view. Maybe about how and when our church buildings should reopen, or how we are responding generally to what's going on. We run the very real risk of those differences becoming magnified too, and therefore the strains on our relationships becoming magnified. And of course, many of us are also having to learn to do things in a very different way. And that too will bring its own stresses. You know, I'm used to standing up and talking in front of rooms full of people. But I have to admit that I find it a lot more stressful talking into a webcam making YouTube videos. And that sense of stress in one area of our life can in turn magnify our concerns and our reactions in others. Now, I realise that many different people engage with these reflections, and you've come from many different situations, and in reality I have no idea what you are facing or you're feeling at the moment. But when I was confronted with this idea of things being magnified, and as I stopped to think about that, I've got to be honest and say that I could think of more than one occasion when I have got unduly anxious and have probably overreacted to things recently. And like I said, things get magnified. And I suspect that most of us will be able to think of occasions in recent weeks when perhaps we have become over anxious, or a relationship has become unusually strained, or maybe our expectations have just been too high and we've put pressure on other people. That idea, therefore, of things being magnified, I suspect may well resonate with many of us. But things being magnified doesn't always have to be a negative experience. In fact, on more than one occasion in the writings of the Bible, we are invited to be those who intentionally magnify things. The Old Testament book of Psalms, in Psalm 34 to be precise, contains these words: "O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Look to him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. That's an interesting invitation. Magnify the Lord with me. Enlarge your vision of God. And I think that's a significant choice of phrase. A magnifying glass makes things appear bigger than they really are. And of course, at one level, we can't make God any bigger. God is infinite, beyond measure. We can't make God any larger. But we can enlarge our vision of God. We can stop to ask ourselves whether somehow we've let our sense of the scale of immediate circumstances diminish our view of God. And of course, although at one level we would have to say that that's what a magnifying glass does, it makes something appear bigger, what we often use one for is not so much to increase the overall scale of something, but to help us see the detail. People like stamp collectors use magnifying glasses so they can study the intricate lines and perforations on their collection. In fact, I think that this particular magnifying glass was originally part of an Insects and Bugs Explorer kit that we bought our son for Christmas one year. And that has something interesting to say to us when we hear again the invitation of the psalm writer to magnify the Lord. In other words, he's not just saying let your sense of the scale of God come into perspective, but maybe also take a closer look, ponder the detail, take time to explore the nature of God, listen carefully to what God is saying. And it's interesting to notice what else the psalm writer says here. I looked and was delivered from my fears. Notice that it wasn't so much the situation that the writer was delivered from as their fear of the situation. Looking to God put everything back into the right perspective. And this is a very common feature of many of the Psalms. Often, although they describe a situation of distress or fear or concern, as we follow the narrative of the Psalm itself, what happens is not so much that the situation changes, but the writer gets things back into their right perspective. These are often described as psalms of reorientation. The reorientation happens when we remind ourselves of the scale and magnitude of the God that we serve, when we take time to ponder the detail of what God says to us and who God is, which in turn causes our perception of the things that generate our concerns and fears to diminish. And so, there is much going on at the moment that will be the source of strain and stress. There is much to cause us concern and anxiety, and many of us will be going through some really tough circumstances. And we can't just make those circumstances go away, but we can stop and make sure that we don't let them get out of perspective. And we can also stop and remember that no matter how difficult and troubling those circumstances might be, God is bigger than any of them. Don't lose sight of that perspective either. And we hear a very similar message in another psalm, Psalm 69, where in verse 30 it says this: I will praise the name of God with a song. I will magnify God with thanksgiving. This will please the Lord more than an ox or a bull with horns and hooves. Let the oppressed see it and be glad. You who seek God, let your hearts revive, for the Lord hears the needy and does not despise his own that are in bonds. And what I find interesting about this psalm is that it's written by someone who really is struggling. I mean, listen to the opening stanzas. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters and a flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for God. And so he goes on. Now, I suspect that these words were not written in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, but many of the experiences and sentiments that the psalm writer recounts echo the feelings and emotions that many have shared with me in recent days. And it's when engulfed by such circumstances that the psalm writer recognizes their need to magnify God, in this case with thanksgiving, by simply taking time to recognize that for all they're going through, they still have things to thank God for. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into this phrase, "This will please the Lord more than an ox or a bull with horns and hooves." But that's an interesting one too, because I can't help reading that and remembering how such animals were part and parcel of the Old Testament worship sacrifice rituals. In other words, I can please the Lord and I can grasp a greater sense of the Lord through my own thanksgiving, even if I can't access the worship rituals that I'm used to. Now, whether or not that was the intent of the psalm writer by making this reference to bulls and ox, I don't know. But it's certainly true of our Christian tradition. We can find and we can magnify God wherever we are, whatever circumstances we're in. Our vision of God does not need to be curtailed or contained by lockdown. So let me invite you to spend some time responding to this invitation. Magnify the Lord. Maybe find those verses from Psalm 34 and Psalm 69 and spend some time reflecting on them. And as you do, here's 3 questions that you might want to ask yourself. What have I got out of perspective at the moment? Are there things, genuine concerns or expectations, but ones that you know you've simply allowed to get out of proportion, and you just need to acknowledge that and kind of recalibrate your vision a bit? Or perhaps you know that there are things that you need to sort out with someone else. Maybe a particular difference of opinion with a friend or a loved one has just become overblown and magnified by current circumstances, and you just need to remind yourself of that and maybe start the process of putting things right. Or dare I say, from some of the conversations that I have been having, perhaps you've been expecting too much of other people. I know some church leaders have felt a real weight of unreasonable expectations in recent days. Maybe that's something you need to get back into perspective. And that in turn might lead you to ask, how can I magnify the Lord? Maybe just take some time to remember just how great our God is. Our God is beyond the scale, immeasurable. But have you allowed yourself to realize that lately? Do you need to reclaim that reality, or maybe just let that truth make a journey from your head to your heart? Perhaps you can take a look back in history and remember that God has been around for generation after generation, present in our history for thousands of years. And as you magnify the Lord, so maybe some of our present concerns will just naturally come back into perspective. And then maybe thirdly, what do I need to consider more closely about God? What are the details that you need to refocus on with your spiritual magnifying glass, so to speak? Perhaps, like the psalm writer, you can magnify the Lord by simply reflecting on those things that you can thank God for, or perhaps just choose a few items of detail and spend time holding them in your heart, so to speak. What is it about God that can really be a source of strength for you at the moment? Psalm 34 invites us to exalt God's name. So what are some of the names or descriptions of God that you've heard that you can bring to mind? Just spend some time with them. Let the detail of them sink in. Pause to think about what those names and descriptions mean, what they might mean for you right now, what they have to say to us in our present situation. There are, of course, many ways that you might do it, but can I offer you the same invitation that the psalm writer offers? Magnify the Lord with me. And that just might help to get everything else into perspective. Thanks for listening.